Hello, coronavirus germs of both sexes. This is the Ticker Guy. Where do I begin today? How about just a roundup of some of the stupidity flying around in the news the last couple of days? Yahoo. The country is still in the firm grip of a pandemic with little hope of release. For every indication of improvement in controlling the virus, new outbreaks have emerged elsewhere, leaving the nation stuck in a steady, unrelenting march of death and infection. Well, a steady, unrelenting march of death and infection that we specifically signed up for. What? What? You say I didn't sign? Yes, you did. Yes, you did. You complied with lockdowns. You complied with 15 days to slow the spread, then 30 more days to slow the spread. Now, an indefinite forward number of days to slow the spread. Governments, including red states such as Indiana, saying they're not actually going to completely reopen until after the 4th of July. Oregon going so far as to say that it's July 6th because, of course, we can't salute the Stars and Stripes. And more and more and more and more. Okay? The premise that you'll never, until there is a vaccine, which will likely never happen, you'll never be able to go to a sporting event where there are lots of people in stands. We were given originally, again, folks, 15 days. We were told we needed to do this. And the reason we needed to do this was to prevent the overload of hospitals. Nobody originally made the assertion that we could actually prevent any infections or the deaths. No one. And then all of a sudden, the screaming Karens and the media and everybody else, the tune changed. Now we must stop the infections. Well, that was never possible. That was always a lie. Flattening a curve does not change the area under the curve. It simply makes it take longer. If you were going to get coronavirus a month ago, you're going to get it now or a month from now. If you were going to die of it a month ago, you're going to die from it now. Does not change the outcome. It just changes timing. That's all it's ever been. That was the premise that we were sold originally, was that Joe, if he had a heart attack when the hospitals were stuffed full of people that had coronavirus, he wouldn't be able to get treatment for the heart attack, and therefore he would die of the heart attack. And that was worth what we did for 15 days. Then all of a sudden 30, then all of a sudden, oh, wait a minute, it's going to go on forever. Because now it's not about that at all. Now it's about you can't die of COVID. But wait a minute, we were never able to prevent people from dying of COVID. And we're never going to be. The people who believe we're going to have a vaccine, you're wrong. We're not. Could I be wrong about that? Well, yes, I could. However, the history of coronaviruses and vaccines for them says that I'm probably not wrong. That if you have an expectation of a vaccine, you're the one who's wrong. Do we have effective treatment modalities? Well, we're learning more about this virus, and in fact, we're learning that all of the modalities that we originally employed, including ventilators and all this, were backwards. They actually killed people. They didn't help them, they killed them. We shoved people in the hole because we were the king of ventilators. And guess who it was that got goaded into doing that? Well, that would be our president. El Presidente. Now he's shipping them all over the world, which, by the way, don't work. As I pointed out very early on when the data came out of Wuhan, the focus had to be on a scientific basis, keeping people from having to be on a ventilator. That we had to find ways to prevent that from being necessary. Because if you went on a ventilator, you were going to die. And that's just the way it is. And therefore, that's not an appropriate treatment modality, and trying to figure out how to make more of them was stupid. But we did lots of stupid things. We're still doing stupid things. Then there's this. We could slow the spread. We could actually prevent infections. Oh, well, wait a minute. No, we can't. What did Cuomo, by the way, the same Cuomo who intentionally forced nursing homes to take COVID-positive patients, thereby infecting huge numbers of people and killing thousands. Okay, what did he disclose just the other day? That 2/3 of the people who ended up in hospitals in New York were in fact obeying shelter-in-place orders. They weren't essential workers. They weren't riding on the subway. They weren't going to this place or that. They were actually obeying his unlawful dictate. and they got sick anyway, which means we didn't slow the spread. We didn't stop the spread. We didn't prevent people from being infected at all. All of these measures were ineffective. They did nothing. Was there a better path? Yes, there was, as I pointed out very early on as well. We could treat this as a sanitarium type of model. We could designate an area that has a central place that anyone who has this infection goes, much like we did for tuberculosis before we had effective treatments, before we had antibiotics. We could say, well, if you got tuberculosis, you go to this particular place. It's a sanitarium. It's the same thing that we did. Well, you do that for COVID. If you have COVID, or if you're suspected of having COVID, you get tested for it, and if you're positive, this is where you go for treatment. Nowhere else. Absolutely nowhere else. We could stand up testing at other hospitals to make sure that people, rapid testing, to make sure that people who do not have COVID don't go into those places. And now all of a sudden there is no problem with hospitals doing elective procedures, nor screenings, nor is there a problem with Joe who has a heart attack. But instead of doing that, instead of taking a sane path and allowing the virus to go through the population and burn itself out, which it's doing anyway, regardless of our measures, we did the absolutely stupidest thing possible. We concentrated positive cases into the most vulnerable populations on purpose, while we have Donald Trump bleating about protecting the most popular, the most vulnerable parts of the population, and we have governors saying it too. They are in fact doing the exact opposite on purpose, and yet no one in this country stands up and drags them out of office by their hair. Pick which set of hair. Why isn't that manslaughter? Why don't we treat it as manslaughter? Why don't you and I, as residents of those states, darn, I don't live in one of those states. All right, I guess I'm not a resident. I can't hold somebody accountable because it's not me. But you can, because it was your grandmother that got killed. And yes, she's dead. And she's dead because of people like Cuomo. Not exclusively. Of course, some of those people were going to die anyway. I mean, we don't want to talk about that either, but that's the truth. Rather than deal with the facts, we just continue to wallow in stupid. 2/3 of the people, folks, again, 2/3, according to Cuomo himself, of the people who have ended up in the hospital in New York were people who were sheltering in place, people who were honoring his stay-at-home order. They were not traveling on the subway. They were not doing this. And yet, he still supports these orders. We have an economy that has been intentionally destroyed when it didn't need to be. We still have governors who refuse to open their economies. We still have, even southern states, even in places where you have some sanity creeping back in, we have these ideas that, oh boy, you're a restaurant. You should have a table out in front and screen everybody who comes through the door. Ask them, have you been in contact with anybody who has COVID-19? And maybe you should even have an infrared thermometer, scan their forehead, make sure they don't have a fever. Because, they might lie. So therefore, we're going to treat everybody as a criminal before, but we won't take their word for it. We're going to actually make them prove it. And is this going to do anything? No, because asymptomatic spread continues to be an issue, and this thing spreads even in people who are locked down. But wait, I thought you told me it doesn't. I thought you told me that this would stop the spread or at least slow it down substantially. What didn't do that in New York, did it? No, actually, the slowing of the transmission rate happened before the lockdowns went into effect. We know that too. We know they were completely ineffective. They did nothing. And yet, we still have all the scaremongering running around. People talking about, oh, this thing's like AIDS. It's going to come back. You get the infection, you appear to clear it, and then, oh boy, here it comes. It's going to come in, it's going to kill you. Well, we don't have any evidence for that. There's none. But it makes a good story. If it's true, then there's nothing we can do, folks. There was always, during the early years of the AIDS epidemic, those of you that don't remember it, I'm old enough that I do remember it. And I remember all the lies that were peddled during that time, too. But during the early years of the AIDS epidemic, there was a very distinct fear that thing was going to jump and become an airborne transmissible virus. And if it did, it would have probably killed 2/3 of the population of the planet, if not more. This thing's nowhere near that deadly, but if it's got that kind of a backside to it, well, you know what? We'll eventually find out. And it will get us. And the age of humans on this planet is basically over. I don't think that's reality, by the way. I think that's a bunch of tinfoil nonsense. But there are people running around peddling that because, you know what, the fear is starting to break, and they've got to find some way to gin it up again. And if it's true, there's nothing we can do about it. Because viruses don't care about your virtue signaling BS. And as we've seen from the results of the lockdowns and where the people are coming from that are going into hospitals in New York, they don't stop you from getting it either. So think about that, folks. Then think about this. We have supply chains breaking with our food supply in particular. We have governments printing up trillions of dollars of new credit. Not money, credit. But you can't print a chicken. How's that working out? Is it making chicken appear in the grocery store? Is it making beef or pork? Or can't print chickens. You can print money, but you can't print chickens. You know, it sounds like a grand scheme to try to flatten things out and make it better. But it doesn't work. We could have and still could lock in nursing homes. Problem with doing that is, at what point do you decide as a resident that you're just willing to take your chances? Because not everybody that is older and has a bunch of comorbidities gets the bad version of this thing and dies. As I pointed out, a very, very close associate of mine, someone who I'm quite close with, had his grandfather killed by this thing, and his grandmother came up positive on a PCR test, so she had it. Not even a sniffle, not a cough. Now, that may change, okay? But I haven't heard anything about it changing. I haven't heard that his grandma's been killed by it, but his grandfather did get killed by it. He didn't die with it. He died of it. Atypical pneumonia caused by the coronavirus. And it killed him real fast, too. Then again, when you're in your 90s, you're well past your use-by date. You know, that's the thing, is that mid-70s for mid to late 70s for a man, and 81-ish or thereabouts for a woman. So the majority of people who've been killed by this thing are people who are past their use-by date. Now, that's still regrettable. It's very sad when anybody dies for any reason, but we all die of something. And I'm not going to be any different than anyone else. Eventually, I'm going to die of something. And we know this. And yet, at the same time, just now, jobless claims come out, 3.169 million. More new jobless claims. We're back at it again. Productivity is also down 2.5% in quarter one. Now remember, folks, this is before the lockdowns really went into effect, because they didn't start until after the end of March. Okay, for the most part. Unit labor costs went up at a 4.8%. 5%. Oh boy. And insured unemployment, folks, was 22 million. Labor reports coming out tomorrow. It's going to be awful. And yet, if we do not stop this insanity, we are going to have no hospitality industry of any kind remaining. I know people say, well, I don't care about cruise ships. Those are all foreign countries. They're all foreign flagged, and they all employ people from third world nations anyway to provide all the services, all of which is true, by the way. They pay them, 50 cents an hour. I mean, really, seriously, if you ever looked into this, you'd freak out. Okay, assuming you care about such things. But, people who go on cruises, they just overlook it, although it's true. But that's not the problem. Problem is there's port cities all over the United States that terminate those things. They have hotels, they have bars, they have restaurants. All of those places have essentially zero business. In the places where they've allowed restaurants to reopen at reduced capacity, none of them, nor the bars that they're associated with, if they have bars, can manage to survive for very long at 50% occupancy. Sit-down restaurant service is one of the toughest ways to make a living. And you cannot survive for any great length of time. And yet the bribes that were given out in the PPA loans that are to be forgiven essentially attempt to force people to maintain an uneconomic business for some period of time. And if you can't do it for whatever reason, you end up on the hook personally. Think about that, folks. You're personally on the hook. So now they can come after you at least civilly and maybe criminally. Of course, it doesn't matter if you're bankrupt. Just jingle mail the keys. Those of you that think that this is all, well, it's just that guy down the corner that owns a bar. Remember that the guy down the corner that owns a bar pays for the sheriff's office in your county, and he pays for the teachers that are in your school. You want those places to be open, and you'd like to have a cop so that when somebody breaks into your house, you can call police and have someone actually show up, right? I mean, look, there's plenty of things cops do I disagree with. All right, I mean, some of the little ones, the speeding traps and things like this are nonsense. But then there's the ones that are truly criminal. But they also do good things, don't they? If you get raped, it would be nice to be able to call a police officer. If you get assaulted or robbed, somebody sticks a gun up your nose, that'd be a good thing, right? That there's cops around. Or would we like to have the literal, by the way, the Wild West wasn't really so wild because they organized posses. You want to go back to that? Are you willing to be a member of the posse? I am. But are you? Are you willing to sling a gun? Are you willing to tell your states that you're not going to put up with any sort of carry restrictions of any kind, period? No licenses, no permits, no. You're going to carry everywhere and anywhere all the time. Why? Because you have to, because there are no police. How about your kids? I mean, look, government schools are crap, but they are fact. How about all the screaming Karens who work for those places? What about them? What about the people at the DMV? I just had to deal with a very nice woman at the DMV. But are all of them like that? No. In many places in this country, they're surly, they're nasty, and they're just not pleasant. I don't live in one of those places anymore, thank God. Goodbye, Illinois. Pritzker's reopening plan. Has anybody actually read it? There really isn't one for the people around Chicago, like ever. And he has said point blank that there will be no normal until there is a vaccine or effective treatment. Well, there are effective treatment modalities. We just refuse to use them. And this allows us to continue to claim that this pandemic is killing people left, right, and center. And folks, sometimes it does. It does kill people. The virus is real. And if you get it bad, if you get hammered by it, it's really bad. All right? But what I said when this thing started was that we have to expect that we're all going to get it, whether we like it or not. I don't have to like that. I have to deal with it. You have to deal with things as they are. Reality is what it is. But what are we doing to our economy? When are we going to stop it? Are we going to stop it? Are you and I going to stand up and insist that it stop? And is that going to happen before or after very critical, evil, bad things happen? Because they're coming, folks. They're already starting. They're starting now. Do we need to make serious reforms to our medical system? Yeah, I've been writing about it for years. I've been screaming about that and raising hell since the 1990s. Literally since the 1990s. I haven't been writing the ticker since then. But I was doing this back when I was running MCS. Because the stupidity of the system then and what it was going to lead to were obvious. They're obvious to anybody that uses their head and can think. And yet nobody cares. Now all of a sudden, the bad is here. And here we are, trying to figure out whether or not you ought to be allowed to force somebody to wear a mask and make an appointment to go get a haircut, which is the world we live in today. Or whether you can actually throw someone in prison, in jail. They jailed a woman in Texas because she was trying to feed her family by opening her hair salon. The judge threw her in jail for this. Is there any evidence to back up any of this? Is there any constitutionality behind any of it? Does the government have the right to prevent somebody who isn't infected, who isn't sick, from going about doing whatever they want to do in their daily life? Basic freedoms, walking down the street. Do you have the right to do that as a government? No, you don't. We fought a revolution 250 years ago over exactly this sort of thing. Along with a couple of % tax, believe it or not, a couple percent. Today, we cower under our desk over something we can't hide from. That's what the data proves, folks. The sanitarium model is the one that makes sense. Reopen the medical centers, reopen the entire economy, and set up a sanitarium model. Field hospitals if you have to, but a sanitarium model where anybody with this bug, that's where they go. And the only people who can ever leave are people who have seroconverted. Just like tuberculosis. We know how to do this, folks. We've known how to do this for 100 effing years. So why don't we? Why do you hide under the desk? Why are you scared? Stop being sheep. And more importantly, stop being scared Nellies. Good Lord. Listen to some George Carlin for a change. May man rest in peace. He's rolling over in his grave right now, the riff that he did on germs. As for the rest of us, we'll see what's left of our economy in another 3 months. Those of you who think this is going to get better, there's going to be a V-shaped recovery, not until and unless the people in our governments stand up and say, number one, we were wrong. Number two, take the mask off. Go about your daily business. And point out the people who did the scaremongering, including, by the way, the blown model out of England, which I'm looking into. There is evidence at this point that that model was not flawed. It was a fraud. It had known bugs where it produced non-deterministic output. That means the code didn't run properly. And think about that, folks. We closed an economy in part over a computer model that was improperly coded. It produced the epidemiological equivalent of the blue screen of death, and we shut down the economy over that. That's criminal. And yet it's what happened. And until we have people in our government and in governments around the world who are willing to stand up and say this and point out the facts, there is no recovery. Because you're still scaring the living bejesus out of everybody you can. There are places in this country where there is a reasonable degree of sanity. I happen to live in one. But it's not enough. There are still, even here, there are plenty of people running around scared out of their wits. And in the big cities, it's 100 times worse. Never mind places like Chicago, which was on the verge of pension collapse to start with. What are they going to do now? Something to think about.